Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Thursday, February the 20th, 2025. This is our series, Questions About God in the Bible. The question that came in this week was, how young is too young to answer God's call? And since this wasn't done face to face, I don't know whether the individual who sent the question in is referring to answering a call to possible vocational ministry, or whether they're talking about salvation. So I'm going to take it as somebody wondering how young would be too young for somebody to put their faith and trust in Jesus. Because a decision about vocational ministry is usually not something that's going to come up until a person is at least high school, college age, or into adulthood. Because my husband was a chaplain in the military and a pastor, I know there were times when people came to him because their child was asking questions about God and expressing a desire to follow Christ in baptism, but mom and dad weren't sure whether the child was old enough to really understand what was going on. In fact, there was one church that he served at after he was out of the military, and he was serving as pastor. And in this case, the music director's 8-year-old child had expressed a profession of faith in Christ. And the parents, and remember, this was the music director at the church's child. The parents would not allow their child to be baptized. They were under the impression that the child needed to be at least 12 years of age to make that decision. And no matter how much my husband tried to talk to them and explain to them that no, that's not the case, you have a misunderstanding of the age of accountability, that yes, this child can be. They still would not allow it to happen. And he wasn't around at that church 4 years later to find out if now they were going to finally allow the child to be baptized, or whether or not the child at that point would still want to be baptized. When people get this idea of age of accountability and the number 12 gets stuck in their head, it's because they have misunderstood what was going on in the New Testament. Joseph and Mary routinely carried Jesus to the synagogue with them in Nazareth, and when they would go down to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the required feast that the men were required to be at and the women were welcome to be at, but not required to be at, because a woman might not be able to travel if she didn't have family members to travel with, or she may be pregnant or recently having given birth, where it just wouldn't be practical for her to travel. But they made it a routine point to worship God. It was his custom to go to the synagogue. It was his custom to go with his parents down to Jerusalem for the 3 feasts that they were required to be at: Passover, Tabernacles, and Pentecost. And so the story in the New Testament about Jesus going with Joseph and Mary down to Jerusalem for Passover, and it makes mention of the fact that Jesus is about 12 years of age at the time. And when the feast is over with and Joseph and Mary are headed back to Nazareth with a caravan that they're traveling with, and they get a whole day's journey away, and they realize that Jesus isn't with them. And so they go back to Jerusalem because they're now hunting for him. And it takes them 3 days to find him. And where do they find him? He's at the temple, where he is being examined by the religious leaders and talking back and forth with them and answering questions from them. And it'll tell you in Luke chapter 2, where this story is told, that the religious leaders are amazed at Jesus' answers. What's going on there is, by the time a young person was about 12 to 13 years of age, they were considered to be adults in the faith. They would go through, in the boys' case, a bar mitzvah ceremony, and it wasn't until modern times that they came up with a bat mitzvah ceremony for girls. But even in biblical times, the boys at age 12 were considered to be adults in the faith. It wasn't that they're just now old enough to understand things about God. No, they're supposed to be being raised from the get-go, from birth, to be raised in the faith. In Deuteronomy, Moses will give the people instructions that tells them you're supposed to be teaching these things to your children as you go about your daily life. It's one of the reasons we do the series that we do called God Conversations, where we're just taking ordinary, everyday things that happen and how you can turn those into faith conversations. If you're an adult Christian and you have children, part of your responsibility as a Christian parent is to evangelize your own family, to talk to your sons and daughters about what it means to know Jesus, to share your own testimony, to be raising them up in the faith. There's a story in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke about a time when people began to bring their young children and their babies to Jesus, and that even his disciples were trying to shoo them away, but Jesus tells them, no, let the children come to me, and he blesses them and spends time with them. One of the VBS stories that we're going to do in our live VBS here at Cool Springs this summer is about Jesus and the children. What should be happening is you should be evangelizing the people that you know, your children, other members of your household, your neighbors, your friends, your co-workers, people that you come into contact with. They should be seeing how Christ is working in your life, and you should be giving testimony of what God has done for you. So you start out by raising that child in the faith, and when they approach God and they say, I want to accept Jesus into my heart, that's the beginning of going from evangelizing that person to discipling that person, because everybody who becomes a believer in Christ, we come to Jesus as we are, but then we need to have our lives transformed by him. So it's a process of lifelong learning. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, because I was being brought to church from the time I was 2 weeks old, that when I was 7 years old, I understood enough about myself and about Jesus and about what I was hearing at church in the Sunday school class and in the training union class and in the nursery extended session, that I was a sinner and that Jesus was the only way I could be saved. And I invited Jesus into my heart as a 7-year-old child. Could I have passed a theology exam at the age of 7? No. But did I know the basics? Yes. I didn't make that profession of faith public for another almost 2 years. I was 8 years old and 10 months, and still probably would not have yet made it public. I was a kid, and I believed in Jesus, and I understood that I'm young, and I don't want to have to walk the aisle of the church twice, because I was a shy kid. I don't want to have to do it twice, and I don't think they'll believe me. So I didn't say anything. My older brother, who was a teenager himself, had surrendered to a call to preach, and because he was a teenager and feeling the call of God to serve in pastoral ministry, he knew he needed to witness, and so he was looking around, who could he practice witnessing on? 8-year-old little sister. I can absolutely remember, I will never forget it, I'm 67 now, so my public profession of faith was 59 years ago, and I absolutely remember the look on my brother's face when he asked me the question, Nancy, have you ever thought about asking Jesus into your heart? And I said yes immediately. How startled he was. It wasn't supposed to be that easy. But it was, because I was being raised in a Christian home. I was going to church. I was being exposed to the Christian faith. And fortunately for me, not only did my big brother believe me, but when he called mom and dad in from the kitchen because they were fixing Sunday dinner while this conversation was going on, they believed enough to let big brother take the keys to the family car. He was 16. He had just learned to drive. to drive me up to the church to meet with the interim pastor that we had at the time. And I actually wound up being baptized on my 9th birthday. That wasn't the end of the story. Okay, she made a profession of faith. She's just a kid. We're not sure how much she understands, but she's baptized. That's not the end of the story. That was just a continuing peg in the lifelong journey of continuing to grow, continuing to learn more about God. Yeah, continuing to make mistakes and be a sinner, but a forgiven sinner, and understanding the difference and growing in my understanding of who God is. How young is too young to receive and respond to a call from God? There is no age limit. In fact, if you want to look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, Samuel's mother had been praying to be able to have a child. She'd been childless for a long time. And she had prayed, and God answered her prayer. And when the boy was weaned, that would be about 3 years old, when you go from breastfeeding to eating solid food. She brought the boy to the temple, or to the tabernacle at the time, to the priest Eli, and she told him, I prayed for this child. This child is the answer to my prayer, and for his whole life, he has longed to the Lord. He was 3. Was he making any kind of a conscious decision on his own? No. Mama and Daddy had made that decision for him, that he will be loaned to the Lord. He stays with the prophet there and the priest Eli. And as he's still a child, 1 Samuel chapter 3, it calls him a boy, a lad. We're not told exactly how old he was, but he was clearly a kid, probably not yet a teenager, somewhere in the elementary school age years. He hears a voice calling in the night. It's God. But he doesn't recognize that voice yet. He thinks it's Eli, and he runs to him. You called for me? No, I didn't call for you. Go back to bed. It happens again and again. And on the 3rd time, it occurs to Eli, God may be trying to call this boy. And so he told Samuel, if you hear that voice again, just say this. Speak, Lord, your servant hears. Samuel did so, and God gave Samuel a message, even though he was a child, to go back and give Eli. And it was a tough message for Eli. It would be a tough message for a grown-up to have to give. And when Samuel shows up and tells Eli, God spoke to me last night, Eli tells him, you tell me everything God said. Don't hold anything back. And as young as he was, Samuel told the truth. And so what was prophesied to Eli came true. And as you read further into 1 Samuel chapter 3, Samuel's still continuing to grow in his understanding of God, and he's growing physically, and he's beginning to do things and give messages from God, and those messages come true, and people are beginning to see God's hand on Samuel. And Samuel will wind up being one of the most important figures in the entire Old Testament. He will be the prophet, the priest, and the judge of Israel for quite a while when he becomes an adult. But people are starting to notice, even when he's still a child, that God's hand is on him. So if you've got a child who is beginning to show signs of interest in God, who is beginning to ask questions about God, don't think for a nanosecond that child is too young, because God takes all of us as we are, where we are, and grows us into what he wants us to be. Don't try to snuff out the Spirit. Even Jesus' disciples made the mistake of thinking that, oh, Jesus has so much more important ministry to do. He needs to be talking with the adults. Don't bother him with the kids. And Jesus had to rebuke them and say, no, let the children come to me. Don't be the one who stops your own child from coming to know Jesus. Thanks for watching.